Hello, welcome to the Natural Selection video notes. Charles Darwin is one of the original thinkers behind the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin is famous because he spent 5 years traveling on board this boat called the HMS Beagle. He was a naturalist and he observed many different plants and animals. He took back samples of these plants and animals and made lots of notes and had lots of observations. He eventually wrote a book called On the Origin of Species, which was highly controversial because it went against the church's teachings of creationism. Darwin was studying organisms, which are individual plants, animals, and single celled life forms in their natural environment. So he looked at these animals and plants in the surroundings or conditions that they lived in, and he was able to notice a few things, including how their bodies and how their behaviors help them survive. Darwin was looking at the adaptations. He noticed that certain animals and certain plants had certain body parts, features, or behaviors that helped them survive and function better in their environment. This process of adaptation occurs through natural selection. If you look at the picture, you will notice three different organisms, and they have all adapted to live better in their environment. So look at the duck. Pause the video and I want you to stop and think to yourself, what adaptations does the duck have to help it survive in its environment? Pause the video here and think, what body parts, features, and behaviors help the duck survive in its environment? All right, welcome back. The duck is going to use its webbed feet in order to swim through the water. The webbed feet are like paddles and they move the duck through the water. They also have feathers that are specially made to be mostly water resistant. They hold like little pockets of air within the spaces between their feathers, and that helps them stay buoyant and it can help them stay warm as well. And they have their bills, which help them collect the food that they eat that's usually in the water, sometimes on the land. Their bills help them to eat as well. Now look at the puffer fish down at the bottom left corner. What adaptations does it have to help it survive in its environment? Pause the video, think about that, and then come on back and we'll discuss. All right, welcome back. The puffer fish, look at that fella. They're not always puffed up like that. They're usually kind of a slim little fish, but if they get scared or if they're threatened by a predator or if they're trying to scare away other organisms, they will inflate themselves. They'll suck in a lot of water and they will poof up, and their spikes will extend from their body, and that will deter most predators. And other predators still might try to take a bite, but they will get a dose of poison and there will be some dire consequences for those predators that still try to take a bite of the pufferfish. Now look at the cheetah in the bottom right. What adaptations does the cheetah have to help it survive in its environment? Pause the video, answer the question, come on back. Welcome back. The cheetah is the fastest land mammal. They also are going to have this fur coloring that helps them blend into their environment, because even though the cheetahs are the fastest land mammal, they cannot run that fast forever. They can only run up to, I think, 75 miles an hour. They can only run that fast for a small period of time. So they have to camouflage to get close enough to their prey so that when they do put out that burst of speed, they can catch their prey very, very quickly. And you may or may not know this, the cheetah is a member of the feline family, and I believe it's the only feline whose claws do not retract. Most cats can push their claws out and pull their claws back. Cheetahs cannot pull their claws back. And their claws actually help them grip the ground when they're running, just like how an athlete will wear cleats in order to help him run through the grass. Cheetah's claws act like natural cleats and they do not retract. Natural selection is the process that ended up giving these different organisms their adaptations. Natural selection is where better adapted organisms are going to live longer, survive more, and reproduce more offspring. The favorable traits that they have become more common over a long period of time because the offspring have those traits that are favorable. So if you look at the rabbit over on the left, what has happened over the course of many, many, many years is there was a population of rabbits who lived in a certain area in the cold frozen north. Those rabbits were going to have different colors because there was genetic variation. Now, what ends up happening is the rabbits that can camouflage end up living longer. So up north, you're going to see these rabbits that have this beautiful white fur during the winter. Those rabbits are not eaten as often by predators, so they're able to pass on their genetics because they're alive and they can breed. Any rabbits that are born or any rabbits that may be in this colder area where it's very snowy but have darker fur are going to be more visible to predators. So a fox that's hunting will be more likely to see a darker furred rabbit. If those darker furred rabbits are hunted more often and killed more often, there will be less of them to spread dark fur genetics to the next generation. This is how natural selection works. Naturally, the predators are going to go after prey that's easier to catch and easier to see. Naturally, the prey animals that are harder to catch and harder to see will be eaten less and they will reproduce more. It's a natural process of selecting which organisms survive. There are four conditions that are necessary for natural selection to occur. The first condition is that there must be genetic variety. The organisms have to have some different traits in their genetics within the same species, even sometimes in the same species. The next principle is there's overpopulation and there's a struggle to survive. So there's more organisms born that can possibly survive based on the amount of food, water, and shelter that's in the area. And then there's principle three, survival and reproduction of the fittest. So the differences in reproduction and survival are because of the variation in the genetics. Remember, we just talked about this rabbit, or these rabbits, this population of rabbits that live in the north. The darker furred rabbits will be killed and eaten more often. The lighter furred rabbits will be camouflaged and they will be hunted less. It's harder for the predators to see them. So the fitness of the rabbits with the white fur is higher than the fitness of the rabbits with the dark fur. Now, when we're talking about fitness in evolution and natural selection, we are not talking about bodybuilders with the biggest muscles who are strutting their stuff on Muscle Beach. No, no, we are talking about how well adapted the animals are to live in their environment. That is what we mean when we say fitness and we're talking about organisms. How well are these organisms adapted to live in their environment? Now, the last condition that we have to talk about is a change in the gene pool because the favorable variation is inherited more often than the unfavorable variation. So, again, in the north, more white rabbits survive, so that variation is going to be inherited by more of the young rabbits that are born. So let's look at this particular graph and apply some of that knowledge about fitness and adaptations and who gets to survive long enough to reproduce. When you look at the graph, you'll see the average number of offspring that were had by mice each year with certain traits. Based on this data, which traits are advantageous to the species? Well, when I take a look at this, I notice There's more long tail mice than short tail mice. There's more big ear mice than small ear mice. And there's more mice that have sensitive noses and less mice that have a nose that's not so sensitive. So if I'm thinking about the more fit individuals will live longer because they have an advantage, the less fit individuals will live a shorter amount of time because they're at a disadvantage, I can reasonably infer that the traits that are most advantageous are long tails, big ears, and sensitive noses. This is a reasonable deduction from the data. So, what sort of evidence led Darwin to think that natural selection was a thing and evolution was occurring? Well, Darwin spent quite a bit of time in the Galapagos Islands, and he saw that there were these little birds called finches. He theorized that the 13 species had a common ancestor. The finches ended up developing these distinctive beaks through this really long process of adaptation, and each different species of finch eats a different kind of food. So, what probably was happening over the course of many, many years is in some areas of the islands, the plants that grew or the food that was available, let's say, was little tiny bugs. So, the finches that were able to catch the little tiny bugs on that part of the island, let's say the south portion of the islands, those birds that were able to catch more of the available food lived longer. Let's say those birds happen to have really small, sharp beaks that they could use almost like tweezers to pluck the little bugs that they were eating for their food. And maybe some of the birds that were born had larger beaks. Maybe those birds with larger beaks had trouble collecting the bugs because their big beaks were not precise enough to pick the little bugs off the ground and off of plants. What do you think is going to happen? Over time, more than likely, less of the larger beaked finches will live on the southern portion of the islands because they can't collect as much food because they have these great big beaks that make it hard to collect the insects that are really, really common. The finches that have the smaller beaks become more common, and more of the offspring have these little beaks. Eventually, you end up with this species of finch with this small beak, and they all end up eating bugs. That's how we get a different species. So the variation is a slight difference in an inherited trait of the same species. So here you see the beaks of the finches, and they're all just a little bit different, which means that depending on what food sources are available, one of these finches is probably going to have an advantage over the other finches. And the finch that has the advantage is going to survive longer and reproduce more. So, all of this, the natural selection, the variation, the adaptations, it all leads to this thing called evolution, which is a change of genetics over time that contributes to new species formation. So, one example again is those darn finches that just keep coming up. Over time, the small variation in beak shapes will lead to different species of finches being born. So the question is, how does natural selection and genetic variation contribute to species evolution? Well, the genetic variation is going to be the thing that is naturally selected for. Certain organisms with certain traits will survive in certain environments. The organisms with less desirable traits will die off, and eventually that change in the genetics will lead to a certain species being produced. Here we see that there's some other examples of natural selection, and we can look at the adaptations and we can also look at the reasons for the adaptation. So for A, we see that to better hide from predators, deer mice that moved to the sandhills in Nebraska changed from light brown to dark brown. So the adaptation is the change in the fur color, and the reason is that they got to hide from the predators. For B, we have this ecosystem where lizards have adapted long legs to help them climb better to avoid floods and reach food. The adaptation is having the long legs to climb better. The reason is that they want to avoid floods and reach food. So the environment is playing a big role in the adaptations here. And for C, the peacocks with bigger and brighter tails attract more mates and mate more often. The fainter colored peacocks are becoming rare. So we see the adaptation is brightly colored tails, and the reason is the peacocks want to mate more often. Remember, survival is the name of the game when it comes to these organisms. Their ultimate goal is to reproduce and pass on their genetics. Diversity is referring to the variety of life that's available or present in different ecosystems, and this variety comes about due to evolution. Now, sometimes all of the members of a certain species will die off due to lack of resources, hunting, predation, or the inability to adapt to some changing environment, and that's what we call extinction. So the first question here says, on an island of only woodpecker finches, and as you see in the picture, the woodpecker finch is going to eat insects. On an island of woodpecker finches, a virus is going to kill off the insects over the course of several months. What's going to happen to the woodpecker finch? Well, they ran out of a resource. They ran out of the food resource. They're likely going to go extinct if they can't fly to another island, or or if the virus does not come to an end. So, how do environmental factors help determine which members of a species survive or become extinct? Remember, the environment is all of the surroundings and conditions that the organism lives in. So, that includes the food, the water, the shelter, the availability of resources, the availability of mates. And if any of these resources are gone, then what we'll see is any member of the species that has a little advantage might survive where other members of the species don't survive. So we could see some more natural selection within that species, which could lead to some different adaptations, and perhaps a new species can emerge if there's a big change to the environment. Selective breeding also happens. Now, listen, a lot of the a lot of the changes to genetics over time, a lot of the evolution is occurring naturally. It's just going on in nature. Things are changing a little bit with every generation. However, humans like to get in there and meddle and mix stuff up. So what do? We come through and we decided we wanted certain plants and animals to perform in a certain way. So we did some selective breeding or artificial breeding, and we decided what traits we want certain animals to have. So if you look at the image here, you'll see in the first generation, all of the poodles were, they have some different sizes. Some of the poodles are a little smaller, some are a little taller. So what did these people do? They took the small poodles, maybe this light brown one here, maybe that light brown one, those are pretty small. This white one's kind of small. And they bred together these smaller poodles to get another generation where the poodles on average are smaller. And then they took these poodles, the ones that seemed the smallest and perhaps had, a cute little face or the nice fluffy fur, and they bred those together. And in generation after generation after generation, you end up with a teacup poodle, a small, cute little poodle with nice fluffy fur, and they only grow to be a certain size, and they're very, very small creatures. This is selective breeding. Why do we selectively breed dogs? Because we want to. We want dogs that can perform a certain job, whether that is herding or shepherding or chasing rats or just being a really, really good companion or maybe even a guard dog. So, why do we selectively breed the dogs? So that they can perform some sort of task or so that they can look the way we want them to look. Selective breeding is also known as elective breeding or artificial selection, and it's not just with animals, but anytime that humans intervene, we're going to see adaptations that happen over a shorter period of time than natural selection. So if you look at this image here, these are what crops looked like thousands of years before the humans started selectively breeding them. So this is an ancient watermelon. I don't know about you, but I would not want to tangle with that if I was trying to get something to eat. This is ancient corn right here. This is an ancient carrot. This is what kale, cabbage, cauliflower, kohlrabi, and Brussels sprouts look like. They're all derived from this wild mustard plant. Eggplants look like this, little tiny things on these little bushes, and this is what a banana used to look like. They used to be full of seeds, much smaller, much stockier. So, what did humans want? Out of the watermelon, they wanted the flesh of the watermelon. So, any watermelons that they were picking, they would save the seeds from the juiciest watermelons and breed together the watermelons that were juiciest and had the most flesh. For the corn, we wanted more kernels. If any of those plants had the particular had more kernels to them, those were bred together. For carrots, we wanted the sweet carrots, we wanted the larger carrots, and someone decided they liked the orange ones. So we got a bunch of orange carrots. But if you didn't know, carrots can also be yellow and purple. There are different colors of carrots. I think there are also white carrots. The banana. People didn't want all those seeds. What a pain to eat. So they bred the bananas to have little to no seeds. We wanted bigger eggplants, so we bred bigger eggplants. The wild mustard, very interesting because there's different parts of the plant that people wanted. So they bred the kale, the cauliflower, the cabbage, the broccoli, the Brussels sprouts, and this one weird plant called kohlrabi. All of those come from a wild mustard plant. And I'm sure if you stopped and thought about it, you could think of other foods and animals and plants that have been selectively bred. Think about the dog breeds, the cat breeds. Cows have even been bred selectively. Cows, goats, sheep have been bred so that there are certain breeds that are really good for producing meat and certain breeds that are really good for producing milk. Chickens, some breeds are really good for producing meat, they just get plumper way faster. Some species, or I'm sorry, breeds of chicken are really, really good at producing lots and lots and lots of eggs. So we have selectively bred these animals and these plants to give us what we need. So stop and think. We have had farms to selectively breeding plants for centuries because we want higher yields, sweeter flavors, brighter colors. Due to foods being shipped long distances, we also bred some crops that are going to ripen slowly and be stronger for packaging. So think about fruits and vegetables where you live that you like to eat and stop and think, what are some things you would do if you were breeding the perfect fruit or vegetable for you, right? So I happen to really love, I don't like oranges so much, but I love orange juice. I would love oranges more if they didn't have the pith. If I were somehow going to breed oranges, I would try to breed an orange with no pith because I don't like the pith. I love a mandarin orange, but I don't like any other orange because the mandarin oranges they use this product called pectinase. I believe it's pectinase. It's an enzyme and it eats away at the pith. And that's why you have mandarin oranges that don't have any pith, and those are just delicious. I love them. Basically, anything you want, you can get out of your plants and animals. And here's one way to get even wilder variations: genetically modified organisms. That's right. You can take the genetics of a different organism and put it into a certain organism if you want to give it that trait. There are fish that glow in the dark. There's corn that has insect resistance, rice that is vitamin enriched, potatoes that are virus resistant, and even soybeans that will not die if you spray them with poison because they were bred to not be susceptible to these things. Why do we do it? To obtain more food. So this is beneficial. This is also controversial. Some people really think that genetically modified organisms should be labeled, and some people don't think it's a big deal. Some people think genetically modified organisms are wonderful and they're really helpful for growing bigger crops and having better yields to feed the planet. And some people feel that this is just man stepping way too far and that people should not be introducing foreign genetics into the foods and beverages, well, the foods primarily that we're consuming. Some people are really concerned about what's going to happen in the long term. This is up for debate. What do you think should happen? So, is there any evidence that evolution has occurred? Yeah, there is, actually. We've got the fossil record. It's the total collection of fossils that we know exist because we found them, and also the fossils that we don't know exist because we have not found them. That makes the fossil record incomplete. We don't know where all the fossils are. We don't know what all the ancient organisms are. Nobody was there with a video camera or a notebook recording what the ancient organisms were. So we don't know what's possible to be found. The fossil record is incomplete. But what we do have gives us a lot of evidence to support the claims of the theory of evolution. One bit of evidence we have is called divergent evolution. So, what happens is there's a common ancestor, and that common ancestor is going to give rise to many different other species. What the common ancestors will also pass on are things called homologous structures. So, these are body parts that are similar but have a different function. So, if you look over here, you will see a human forelimb, a cheetah forelimb, a whale forelimb, and a bat forelimb. So a forelimb is going to be like the arms or the front legs. A hind limb is going to be like legs on a human or the back legs on many other creatures that have four legs that they use for moving around. If you look really carefully, you'll see that the bones are color coded. The blue bones at the top are called the humerus. Then you have these two bones in the middle. One is sort of a bright orange and one is kind of tan. Those are the radius and the ulna. The radius and the ulna are up here on the whale, and there are these long bones here on the bat. And then you have let's see, these are carpals, the sort of green colored bones right here. The carpals on the whale are kind of stubby. The carpals here on the bat are really long. And then you have phalanges. The bats have nice long phalanges, so does the whale. A couple of long phalanges, a couple of short little phalanges. The cheetah has phalanges, those are its toes. The humans have phalanges, those are our fingers. So see how the structure is similar. The bones are similar. It's the same bones, it's just they're shaped differently and they have a completely different function. Humans, we use our arms in order to hold stuff, grab stuff, pick up things. Cheetahs are going to use their forelimbs to help them run and move. Whales will use their forelimbs to help them swim. Bats will use their forelimbs to help them fly. So it is reasonable to conclude that even though these structures have different functions, when you look closely, they have a really similar structure, and it's reasonable to conclude that there must be a common ancestor behind all of these mammals. We also see convergent evolution. So what happens here is there's no common ancestor, but similar body parts developed, and these are called analogous structures. So you see, the bat, the bird, and the insect all have wings, but they they look a lot different. They look really, really different, but they have the same function. A bat wing, a bird wing, and an insect wing, they don't have a lot of the same structures, but they have the same function. All of these animals are flying somewhere, but they're not related from a fossil or genetic standpoint. But not least, we have vestigial structures. These are basically useless structures. They're left over from the ancestors of these organisms, but they no longer serve a purpose. Like, this is a whale, beautiful, majestic creature of the ocean, and it has leg bones, but it's not walking anywhere. At some point, we can reasonably deduce or infer the whales had an ancestor that lived on land and had back legs. But those back legs, slowly over the course of many, many, many years, they got smaller and smaller until they just were no longer existent because they were no longer needed. Humans have an appendix, which basically exists to make you sick, because if they get infected, you could get really ill. They have to be removed. But the appendix doesn't really serve very much purpose in a human these days. These are vestigial structures.